What really unites these two, over and above the trade and shared interests and whatever, is they both see the global order as just being too Western leaning, and have for a long time. And the real crux of what motivates their relationship is this shared belief that that global order should be shifted and that it should look further east.
Vladimir Putin has arrived in China for a state visit just days after Donald Trump. And this is why. Hi everyone, Neil Patterson here, host of This Is Why, and isn't it nice to be popular? Because Chinese President Xi Jinping certainly is that right now. Vladimir Putin has arrived in Beijing for a state visit with all the pomp and ceremony and flag-waving wee kiddies that you would expect. Donald Trump was there less than a week ago, again to meet Xi, a man Trump describes as a great leader. The US president returned to the States after his second state visit to China with, well, pretty much nothing to show for it. Putin, well, he is on trip number 25, and guess who shares his desire to reshape the world? Helen-Ann Smith is Sky's Asia Correspondent, based in Beijing. Helen-Ann, just tell us about this summit. A lot going on, apparently.
Yeah, really, really busy. I mean, look, firstly, I should say that it's not as if Xi Jinping doesn't hold leaders here pretty often. So some of the staging in the ceremony follows a relatively well-worn playbook, if you like. But my goodness, they have crammed it in today. Busier and fuller is the agenda than I think any sort of diplomatic visit here that I've seen for absolutely ages. This morning, he arrives at Tiananmen Square, at the Great Hall of the People, this huge ceremonial building. It's kind of China's equivalent of Parliament. It's where the big moments happen. And he is given the sort of full ceremonial welcome. As I said, there's different sort of gradations of that, depending on how important you are as a leader, frankly. But he was given the top version. So full honor guard, troop inspection, national anthems, gun salute, cheering children. They then had a big signing ceremony. Xi Jinping and Putin then did a statement to the press, which is pretty unusual, certainly from China's side. I mean, when I say statement to the press, I mean they read pre-scripted remarks and nobody asked them any questions. But nonetheless, that staging is quite unusual.
And even in the margins of that crammed itinerary, look, we were sitting here back at base watching what was going on where you are, the feed of the pictures coming in. And there was this event taking place we couldn't quite work out. There's the Russian president standing in this fairly nondescript room with a Chinese man whose face I didn't recognise at all. But apparently there's quite a heartwarming story behind this encounter.
Yeah, a really heartwarming story. It's a gentleman who's now an engineer, and it turns out that this guy met President Putin in the early 2000s when he was a child, when Putin was on one of his very first visits to China. This is his 25th, it's worth adding. And this guy basically said that he was so inspired by this childhood meeting with a young Vladimir Putin that he decided he was going to go and study in Russia, which he then did. Went and studied engineering in Russia, now speaks fluent Russian. He's now in his late 30s, married with kids. I think he made a sort of a quip in the press here that his job is to build physical bridges, and he wants to also build metaphorical bridges between Russia and China. So I think both sides thought that was quite a nice little story and quite a nice little demonstration of the kind of interpersonal relations that they're really trying to sort of ham up here, I think.
Yeah, none of which is to say that this isn't a very substantive meeting. I mean, in terms of the agreement side, more than 20 of them, trade, technology, energy and more. Just walk us through what has actually come in concrete terms from this summit.
20 signed agreements, we understand, from, everything from trade to education, science and technology, energy, innovation, media, all these different sectors. There was this signing ceremony, as we saw, and all these different sectors coming and signing their various agreements. But there was one that Xi and Putin signed themselves, which I think is particularly worth pointing to. So they signed what is being catchily named a joint declaration on the establishment of a multipolar world and a new type of international relations. Now, that sounds a little bit lofty, but I think that's quite interesting because essentially, and there's been a lot of reference to this in the kind of different speeches and opening addresses, and you can read it in the nuance of their language, but there's been a lot of talk and a lot of reference to the fact that they both see this partnership as a very stabilizing force within a sort of a changing global world. And I think that's really important because, of course, what really unites these two over and above the trade and sort of shared interests and whatever is they both see the global order as just being too Western leaning and have for a long time. And the real crux of what I guess motivates their relationship is this shared belief that that global order should be shifted and that it should look further east. And certainly China increasingly feeling that it should be at the head of that new global order.
So what ultimately then does she want from Putin and vice versa? I mean, it on the face of it, at least, it looks like Russia needs China a lot more than the other way around.
Yeah, it's not just on the face of it. That is the reality, Neil. 100%. Russia needs this relationship far, far more than China does. And there is a deep imbalance in the relationship. And look, that was the case before the war in Ukraine, but it is absolutely the case now. I mean, we are talking about China's economy is 8 times the size of Russia's. China is by far Russia's biggest trading partner. It buys a third or well over a third of both its imports and its exports. It is really, really important. But for China, Russia only makes up 4% of its trade, only 4%. So that huge imbalance there. And obviously, since Russia undertook that full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2021, that reliance has only increased. The Russian economy, frankly, could have faced collapse were it not for the fact that China continued to buy its goods and, most importantly, its energy and its oil. So China has given Russia enormous financial backing in that sense, that sort of China disregarding international sanctions and continuing to do business. China has always said it's neutral in the war, but it absolutely supplies Russia with dual-use items that have been really, really useful in its military campaign, particularly things like drone components, very, very important. And also, China has given Russia absolutely crucial diplomatic cover over these years. So, Putin, remember, has an international arrest warrant on his head, but China provides it these diplomatic forums whereby he can continue to at least keep up the appearance of traveling the world and meeting with dignitaries. He's able to come to sort of the BRICS summit, which is a kind of a coalition sort of around Russia and China and India and South Africa and so on. But in return, China doesn't need Russia in quite the same way, but it absolutely likes to have plenty of the things that Russia gives it. That's absolutely the case. It does see Russia as a stable source of oil and energy, for sure. And that kind of need for stability has obviously been only heightened since the war in Iran and the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. They like and they want to have certain military intel from the Russians. There are certain military things that Russia is good at. China is very happy to have some of that information, some of that expertise. But crucially for China, I think the biggest sort of thing that they want the Russians for is just a strong and strategic partner in this sort of global narrative and global push that I was talking about before to sort of shift and reorient the global order, because Russia is so in China's pocket that China has such leverage over it, and that gives it real power.
Xi Jinping, I mean, he's been quite a busy man recently. I mean, it was only 5 minutes ago that he had President Trump turning up on his doorstep for another summit. I mean, just for a second, Helen-Ann, just compare and contrast. Are there material differences between the reception that Trump had and the reception that Putin is currently receiving?
The Trump summit, of course, was meant to be all the way back in April or late March, early April, and it was delayed because of the war in Iran. So this literal back-to-back, week-to-week, a matter of days is sort of an accident. So they were encouraging us not to make comparisons, but it's almost impossible not to, isn't it? China doesn't do anything by accident. China thinks very carefully about staging and protocol. So in terms of just the staging and the ceremony, it was almost exactly equal. And I think that was probably important and intentional. But when you take away from the staging, just the interpersonal warmth between them, the wording of the opening statements, as I said earlier, just the crammed nature of the agenda, I think all of this speaks to a relationship that is actually just on far, far better footing. And I think that's been quite obvious. I mean, the images of Xi and Trump from last week, I mean, some of it was very awkward, very, very awkward. Just the physical stiffness of them when they were sort of walking around the Temple of Heaven. There was a really funny moment, I thought, on day 2 of the Trump summit, where Xi Jinping took Donald Trump on a walk around the gardens of Zhongnamhai. Now, Zhongnamhai is the compound in the center of Beijing that Xi Jinping lives. It's very secretive. Very few leaders get to go in there. Very few people have ever seen inside it. And there was this quite funny moment where they're walking around and Trump says to Xi Jinping, so do you invite other leaders here often? Is this a bit of a privilege, essentially? And Xi turns around and says, no, rarely. I rarely host leaders here, but Putin's been here. So, that tells you everything you need to know, that he just sort of drops it in there. And look, I think there is no denying or debating who Xi Jinping prefers. It's pretty clear. He's a very inscrutable man. It's often hard to read, but he's been smiling today, and I didn't see him smiling that much last week.
Even though on the substance, I mean, yeah, of course, Donald Trump's visits are always going to generate plenty of headlines, but he didn't get a deal on Iran. He didn't get any action on AI. Arguably, he handed Taiwan to China on a plate. I mean, Putin's leaving when he does leave, with far, far more in his back pocket.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, the Trump visit was so rich in optics and really light in detail. Actually, very interestingly, just today, China's Commerce Ministry have actually released a statement kind of summarizing some of the achievements from the Trump visit. Perhaps they actually actively chose to do that today just to sort of exactly avoid the type of comparison that we're just about to make. But there wasn't that much in there. I mean, there was an agreement to sort of keep talking about tariffs. There was an agreement for China to buy 200 Boeing aircraft. Even that, significantly less, significantly fewer than the Americans had been hoping for. There was an agreement to set up a board of trade and a board of investment. So lots of agreements to keep talking about things, not much actual deals. And look, I mean, I think it is important to say, look, it's not as if these two relationships were coming to these summits from the same place. Of course they weren't. America and China were coming to this summit from a period of really unprecedented instability. And there was a lot of work to do to just steady the ship, if you like. And actually, you could argue that even just the fact that Donald Trump was here was stabilizing. Even the fact that they have agreed to keep talking about some of this stuff is stabilizing. It's unlikely they were ever going to sit down and reach this kind of raft of agreements. But I think it absolutely shines a light on the fact that the US-China relationship is one that needs to be essentially managed competition. And the Russia-China relationship, for all of its imbalance, and my goodness, there is a lot, and China will use that to its advantage, but it is a relationship that does have degrees of trust in there.
Look, Helen, even if we accept that the timing of the Putin visit is entirely coincidentally just the week after Donald Trump pitched up, personally, I'm a little bit sceptical. You could have stuck a few more buffer days in there if you really wanted to. It looks great for the Chinese, doesn't it? There's almost a feeling of kind of courting the emperor, that Xi Jinping sits in his palace and, here comes the president of the United States coming to ask for his help. Oh, look, here comes the president of Russia coming to bolster the relationship. I mean, the optics, as we say in this game, they're brilliant for Xi.
That's absolutely right. And it's not just this last 2 weeks with the president of Russia and the president of the United States coming here. It's been the case all year. There has just been a parade of foreign leaders here to China, from the Germans, the French, Keir Starmer from the UK, the King of Spain has been here, and then let alone all the leaders from the global south and Africa and Southeast Asia who are here relatively regularly. I mean, as I say, I live here, and Xi Jinping is almost always hosting someone. Remember, at the crux of everything that China is about and that China aims for and works towards is this image, and they hope the reality, that China should and could be considered the sort of grown-up superpower in the room, the new global leader, that the world should look to it for stability and global leadership. And frankly, you could argue that it's playing its hand unbelievably well at the moment. It does look like the stable power at the moment, doesn't it? It does look like the slightly more predictable partner if you're a Southeast Asian nation and you want to kind of do trade with someone who's not going to slap tariffs on you suddenly.
So is that what all of this is all about? Is that ultimately Xi's, overriding strategy, that there is a restructuring of the global world order, and in circumstances in which you have Donald Trump in the White House, well, where else does the rest of the world turn?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think China has long viewed the global order as too Western centric. It has long felt that the sort of balance of power in the world is unfair. It has often pointed to what it calls hegemony. And when it talks about hegemony, it is talking about the United States essentially just doing what it wants and when it wants. And, frankly, Donald Trump in the White House has just put so much fuel to the fire of those accusations. And there are so many countries, particularly in Asia and the global south, who are now looking to China. Countries, for instance, who had sort of USAID pulled from under them, countries who really rely on trade with the United States, who are slapped with enormously high tariffs. And China quietly has started to step in funding some of those USAID projects that the US has pulled out of. China has been reaching out to countries like Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam, who have really struggled with tariffs, and said, don't worry, we'll be there. And if you like, Russia is only one small part of it. Really, this is the game of China coming out on top.
A complicated dynamic is one way of putting it, because, well, you know this better than I do. I mean, Russia, China, I mean, there may well have been a long-standing personal relationship between, the Russian premier and the Chinese premier, but these two countries were not always allies.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we sort of think now, because of the kind of good relations between these two, and just in this summit today, they've been talking about sort of unprecedented levels of US-China relations. But these are not two nations that have historic levels of trust. They share a long border. There has been long history of acrimony along that border over many hundreds of years, and they don't instinctively trust each other actually as two nations. And I think that's really important, particularly from China's side. We've always got to remember, when in the way that China handles its sort of international relationships, it is always pragmatic. It is always strategic, and it will always lean into its relationships, but only insofar as it suits them. So China will do deals with the Russians. It will use the Russians insofar as it needs them. But do they truly trust the Russians? I'm not so sure about that. I just want to give you one example, Neil. When Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2021, just 2 days before that invasion, Xi Jinping and Putin sat down ahead of the opening of the Beijing Winter Olympics, and they'd signed what they called at the time a no limits partnership. Then the invasion of Ukraine happened, and the Chinese were absolutely silent for days after that. Everybody thought, the Chinese must have known in advance. And actually, a lot of analysts truly believe, and those close to the Chinese government at that time believed, that Chinese were actually really taken aback and really blindsided by that invasion, and actually didn't really like it. And there's lots of people who say that although China has, of course, been helping Russia to a degree, if China really wanted Russia to sweep to victory, it could just make that happen. It's certainly powerful enough to do so. And it has chosen not to. And I think there's a degree to that China doesn't want to see a massively over-empowered Russia, because a massively over-empowered Russia is actually a danger to it as well.
But in terms, though, of this strategy of trying to portray China as the kind of the adult in the room when it comes to the global major powers, I mean, how much of that is truth and how much of that is a facade? Yes, they're stable. Yes, they're pragmatic. All the rest of it. But, this is a country that still has designs on Taiwan, and, has a litany of human rights abuses as lang's my arm.
Yeah, and actually some of the sort of hypocrisies were just so on show today, I think. One of the sort of statements that Xi and Putin were sort of making to each other in some of their opening remarks was how they as powers are working together towards global peace and security. And you think, really? The country that sort of unilaterally invaded a neighbor. Yeah, it's important to point out Taiwan, because remember, if China's number one objective is to be sort of the ascendant superpower in the world, its number two objective is to take over Taiwan. So when Donald Trump launches an attack of Iran, China sees it through the lens of how might this harm or potentially help a future invasion of Taiwan for us. They don't want to see the Iranians too weakened. They want their oil. They want their sort of influence in the region. But they don't mind one bit the US being distracted and depleted elsewhere. It means the Chinese can focus on what they want. They don't mind one bit if US public opinion is sort of worn down and they lose their appetite for international intervention. They're pretty happy to see that. And crucially as well, they might say in public that they criticize the breaking of international law when it comes to some of Donald Trump's adventures. But actually, it sort of potentially gives them a little bit of license when they might potentially skirt close to international law on some of their plans in the future. So take everything, I think, that China says with a pinch of salt. However, I do want to just make one counterbalance point to that, and that is that I do think China wants to be seen as sort of responsible and stable more than the Russians do. I don't think they are the same as Russia. I think they have looked at what's happened in Ukraine and learned lessons from that. I do think they value their position on the international stage more than the Russians did. And I do think it is important to them.
Look, for all this talk of a multipolar world, America withdrawing somewhat, China trying to expand its sphere of influence. I don't like to be parochial, but it is my podcast. I mean, what does all this mean for the UK?
It's such an interesting question, Neil. Let's put it this way. Keir Starmer was here in Beijing himself earlier this year. And to say that the welcome he was given was a shadow of what Donald Trump and Putin have been given is an understatement. He did not get the honor guard. There was no Tiananmen Square band. I mean, it really was run of the mill compared to what Donald Trump and President Putin have experienced. And I think that says a lot about kind of the UK's position, certainly in terms of how China sees it. I think in the sort of great power play in politics, I don't think any of them consider the UK to be an enormously big or important player, certainly not here in China. China might see the UK as one of the European powers that really likes to kind of put pressure on them vis-a-vis Ukraine. I mean, it's worth saying there are certain things that the UK has that China really values. It really values sort of the, what they call the sort of the information economy. So sort of universities and intellectual property and sort of science and chemical research, things like that are considered very valuable by the Chinese. But it is just not considered to be the gravitational player that perhaps it once was.
To hear more about how China is benefiting from the war in Ukraine, you might want to have a listen to our sister podcast, The World. This week, they've been taking a look at how Chinese drones bought by Russia are fighting other Chinese drones bought by Ukraine. Security expert Phillips O'Brien on The World says he believes we're not far off robots replacing soldiers on the front line. But that's a lot from us for today. We're back again tomorrow.